To the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Every Friday night, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, and simulcast on cjmorrisradio.com, 365 live. And tonight, for the first time live, we're on with hazyradio.com, and they're going to be carrying us every Friday night as well. We're also rebroadcast throughout the week on awakeradio.us, firehorseradio.com. Tomorrow we're going to be starting something new on something called Penny Entertainment, and they're going to be playing us in the afternoon as well. And also, too, don't forget Shake and Wake Radio. We're going to be on rotation over there with good old Rick and Annie. Going to be playing our shows. Tonight I got a great show. I got a guy who was actually a hero of mine. I grew up looking up to this guy as a real character back in New York. But a real performance artist and a real genius in a lot of ways. His name is Abel. He's a media hoaxer. But this is the guy that started it all. He got the ball rolling for us, other stuff like that. And I'm going to be introducing him in a bit. Coming up next week, we got John Poston, and we're going to be talking about his book about the Tupac Shakur murder and COINTELPRO involvement in the hip-hop movement, all kind of stuff like that. And then we have Professor Ward Churchill, who's going to be coming on in another couple of weeks. And he's written a whole ton of books about the Baader-Meinhof gang and the Red Army faction, and about a lot of interesting stuff. And then we have Bobby Seale from the original Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. He'll be coming on soon as well. Hey, and I want to give a big shout-out, by the way, to my congressman, Joe Heck, who was a big help to me this week. I was in a little bit of trouble. I needed some help. I reached out to my congressman there, and they jumped right on it. They were a big help, and I want to thank them for that. Okay, let's not waste any time. We got Genius. I have Genius on hold. I have Mr. Alan Abel. My friend Alan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Ed, but I want to know, do you have an audience out there?
Yeah, no, we got a lot of people listening, yeah.
Well, I mean, is this just for your friends and neighbors in your house? I'm not sure.
Hey, man, I got to worry about you. How do I know this is really Alan Abel?
I know. You better believe it. I know I've had to take a lie detector test before, but it's really, I'm the right one. Although there is there are lots of Alan Abels around. You know, if you Google them, you'll find there was a chap who retired from the Philadelphia Symphony. Had the same name as mine, same spelling. And he was from Hobart, Indiana, that you probably never heard of. And I'm from Coshocton, Ohio, that you never heard of. But nevertheless, I gave a lecture in high schools years ago, and I drove up to Hobart, Indiana, and they had a big banner outside the school saying, "Welcome home, Alan Abel." And I thought, gee, that's strange. And the superintendent came out and said, "You're not Alan Abel." I said, "Yes, I am." I had to show him my driver's license to prove I was, and I did the lecture. But I realized for the first time there's another Alan Abel, from another town. So, and he also gave lectures and beat the drums, as I did occasionally. And so we were very similar age and everything. It's just real weird. It's called a doppelganger, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's like an impersonator or a double.
Oh, yes. But, I don't know about this idea of, I don't crash parties. People think that hoax and fraud are synonymous. Because whenever somebody steals $2 million, or $100 million, or $75 billion, like Bernie Madoff, he sure did make off with the money, didn't he? And they say, oh, well, big hoax, the Ponzi scheme, he got everybody's money, and then he's got to sell for the rest of his life. 150 years, how can you live for 150 years? Nice sentence from the judge. But, I've been doing it for fun. I mean, my motive is to give people a kick in the intellect. And so I stage all of these various hoaxes, and I've done over the years. I had a backer for about 20 years, back from 1962 until about 1982, Maxwell Sackheim. He founded the Book of the Month Club, and we met on the subway accidentally in New York, hanging on to the straps, because it was filled up with people. And he's laughing at the overhead ads that they have on this ad rack, and I'm not laughing, and he's poking me, because there's an ad that says, "For rent, bathroom, seats 2, plenty of hot water, near a bus stop." And he said, "Why aren't you laughing at that?" I said, "Because I wrote the ad. I filled the empty spaces for the New York subway system with crazy ads in order to entertain people, like also for sale squid. We'll eat anything, very fond of children, and so on." But I met Max on the subway, and we started talking, and he said, "Well, look, you got to have lunch tomorrow," because he said, "I've never ridden the subway in my life, And this is the first time. And I founded the Book of the Month Club, and I have millions of dollars, and I'm going down to Largo, Florida, and retire in about a week. And my wife said, you got to take the subway just once in your life. And here's an 82-year-old man now, only one time on the subway in that car, standing up, holding the strap next to me, and we became friends, and he became my backer. And for the first hoax, which was in 1960-ish, was to clothe all naked animals for the sake of decency, because a nude horse is a rude horse. And I said, you have to clothe every animal, because how can you explain to a young child why Rover the dog is naked and you and Daddy and Mommy are not? And you can't. So he grows up with a double standard of living and turns to drinking and smoking and gambling and running away from home. And this campaign took off like a grass fire. There were headlines in the San Francisco Chronicle. Walter Cronkite featured it one night on the CBS Full Network, and he went to his grave angry because he found out it was a joke, and it took him a while, and someone called in and said, these guys are pulling your leg. And he was so angry. A friend of a friend who had dinner with Walter about 3 or 4 months before he died, and Walter said, I really hate that guy, Abel, because he fooled me into thinking that the Society for Indecency to Naked Animals was real, and it wasn't. And he had this guy, this friend of his, posing as G. Clifford Prout, the president of the agency, and his real name was Buck Henry. He wrote The Graduate for the movies, he wrote Guest Mark for television, and That Was the Week That Was, and Saturday Night Live.
Let me ask you this. Did you stay friends with Buck Henry?
Yeah. So Walter, here's the end of that little anecdote. Yeah. He told this friend of a friend who got back to me that he's still angry for years and years and years. That happened in 1960s, the mid-60s, and now he passed away 40 years later, and he's not mad at Saddam Hussein, he's not mad at Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, right, or Gaddafi, or Castro, but the guy who fooled him about putting clothing on animals, like Bermuda shorts on horses or a moo-moo on a cow. Now, as soon as I say moo-moo on a cow, you should get suspicious, don't you think?
Hey, but let me, you're right, you think you would have caught on. But now, yep. when you were coming up with that scam, that joke, did you think it was too over the top and you were going too far?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, did you think maybe you were going over the top and you were going too far and people were just going to know it was obviously a joke?
Well, nobody seems to get that joke. And it wasn't really just a joke for a joke. I was really trying to make fun of censorship. If you're going to censor books and records and films, what about censoring those naked animals? But nobody saw through that allegorical satire. Nobody. Even seasoned reporters didn't find it out. And in fact, when we picketed, I had a few friends, we'd go out to Washington, we picketed the White House. And at that time, in the early 60s, Macaroni was naked. That's Carolyn's pony. And apparently, John Kennedy was watching us through binoculars laughing, and Jacqueline was angry. She was just absolutely, totally, devastated by the fact that these crazy people want to put clothing on Macaroni, that poor little pony. So I found that out from Jim Alkencloss, who was Jackie Kennedy's half-brother, and I met him on a plane ride to Cleveland once we were talking, and this is back in the 70s, and he told me that he was in the White House at that time as a high schooler, and he was cutting out newspaper articles and pasting them up in the scrapbook for John Kennedy to read at breakfast, all the important articles. And he was there when he heard John Kennedy laughing hysterically, and he went out and watched us pick at the White House. Well, there were just half a dozen of us, But we made a headline in the Washington Post, and, it's really gratifying to see that the media, in between the axe murderers and the serial killers, they do have a bit of levity, and they go for what seems to be an offbeat story. And there's a lot of it today, but of course the Internet provides a barrier of sorts, because in 2 seconds you can pop up a million researchers and answers, and it's like having the Smithsonian in your living room. So there's an enemy there called the Internet that finds out exactly what you're doing, because when Idi Amin ravaged Uganda, and I had a look-alike marry a wasp at the Plaza Hotel in New York so he could get American citizenship and be a threat to the State Department in the United States, we had 150 reporters turn out for that wedding, supposedly. But, it was all, again, just to embarrass the State Department, because they were allowing Amin, who had fled from Uganda to South Africa and had a sanctuary there, a villa with his wife, and wives, I should say, and children, and a whole host of children. and an airplane that could fly to Miami and have diplomatic immunity and come back with cigars, champagne, and ladies at night. So
hey, well, that brings up a good question, okay? Because did you have a political agenda when you were coming up with these hoaxes?
Did I have an agenda? Because I'm getting a mixed sound signal back here for some reason.
Okay. Yeah, a political agenda.
What was your question, Ed?
Yeah, like did you have a like your politics? Were your politics left or right? And you're making a political statement with these hoaxes.
You're asking about my politics?
Yeah.
Well, when Stuart B. McKinney, a representative in Congress, died of AIDS back in the 80s, there were 3 months left in his term, and I ran for Congress to replace him on an independent ticket. And I went down to Washington and measured the office in case I would win and want to redecorate. And I campaigned there, and I lost by a landslide, by the way, because, people didn't want to hear a guy who wanted to put a suggestion box on the White House fence and take Congress off salary and put them on straight commission. So I got more votes than Mickey Mouse or Johnny Carson at the time. But nevertheless, I said if I won, I was going up against Christopher Chase, who won the election. I would resign, the first task in office.
Now, were you running as Alan Abel, or were you running as a character?
I ran as myself, as Alan Abel. So I had a lot of media coverage because people right away said, "Oh, well, you're the guy who does hoaxing, aren't you?" My credibility is zero, obviously, and it's very hard for me to prove who I am. In fact, I became a senior citizen not too long ago. Don't ask how old I am, because age is a matter of the mind. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And the ticket taker at Grand Central Station refused to believe that I was a senior citizen. And I said, "You're not old enough to work here either, selling tickets. You look like you're under 18, which he did look like. And so we had to exchange, again, driver's licenses, and the people in line were all laughing. We held up the line. But it's fun, to know that you're getting younger and laughing, because laughter is the only tranquilizer without side effects. And, it releases endorphins in our body that are very healing and protect our immune system. But you don't find people laughing. How many people do you see walking around whistling or laughing? And I listen to the birds whistle. We have a bird up here in Connecticut where I am that sings about 6 measures of April in Paris. And he's been doing it for 200 years. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. Vernon Duke claimed that he wrote that song in 1930 and copyrighted it and made millions. And he's dead now. So I went after his estate, and I've been trying to find a lawyer to, file suit and collect some royalties for the birds. It's the black-throated green warbler that sings the first few measures of April in Paris for 200 years, and they're not getting a dime from that estate so far. But that's a copyright situation. You don't want to get into that. That's a whole legal jungle by itself. The birds are getting screwed, in other words.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay.
Okay, but I digest. With Idi Amin, I just went in the subway system. Maxwell Sackheim said he would finance that wedding. It cost me about $26,000. But when you made millions on the Book of the Month cover, a few $1,000s don't mean anything.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Now, the guy who was financing you, and he was doing this as a lark.
He did it just as a lark, and of course when he passed away, that was the end of the financing. So I haven't had anyone major like that. It's prevented me from doing the big ones. And the last one I was going to do before Max died, unfortunately, was to land the Loch Ness Monster in the Loch Ness in Scotland and then discover it. And I had a fellow actually build the Loch Ness Monster in 3 sections. It floated and looked like it, and it was about 30 feet long. We were going to drop it in there quietly some night, and the next day with a helicopter pick it up and fly it back to the British Museum and offer it to them, try to negotiate a sale, of course. But no money changes hands, actually. I don't go across that line that would be in fraud, because as soon as you accept money for doing things that aren't true, you're in great trouble.
Okay, then how did you earn a living besides doing all the hoaxes? What is your day job been?
Well, I've done lots of lectures. I've given lectures. I've given about 2,000 lectures over the past 40 years, actually, and I get paid nicely for that. And also, I'm also a percussionist. I used to be a substitute drummer at Radio City Music Hall, And that was back in the early days when there were 55 musicians in that orchestra pit. And when I got out of Ohio State College, graduated in the late 50s, I came to New York with the goal of, playing with the music hall. And I knocked on the stage door, and the conductor, Raymond Page, came to the door, and I said, I heard your drummer, Billy Gladstone. I can play much better than he. I've seen the show 3 times. Could I come in and audition for you? And he said, no way. He said, I've got 14 drummers on a list. And he slammed the door. And I was devastated because for 4 years in college, I thought, I'm going to New York and play at Radio City. Well, I solved that problem by getting 100 postcards in those days, and that was in the late 50s. And I mailed a postcard every day to the music hall to the conductor, reminding him I was available and only 20 minutes away by taxi if he needed me. Well, he was ready to kill after about 80 postcards. But then on the 81st postcard, his drummer, Billy Gladstone, called in ill and had to go to the hospital. And in a moment of rage, the mail arrived, and there was my postcard with my phone number. And he called me and said, come on down. We need you. The first show is in 45 minutes, and you'll have to sight read it. Well, that's great. I did. So I went down and sight read the show, and I was taken right under his wing, and I stayed there for a number of years as a regular substitute. They offered me the job many times at double salary, and I wouldn't take it because, it's a treadmill to oblivion. I worked for the AAA, and I used to have to draw a green line on the maps to tell people how to get from one place to another. And I got this engraved letter once from, I think it was Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is a very high-class, expensive place in Michigan. And the lady wanted to know how to get from Long Island to New Jersey, and she wanted a scenic route. And she was in Great Neck vacationing. So I sent her by way of Montreal, Canada, because it's a scenic route to go up to Canada and then come back down on the other side of the Hudson. Well, I got fired, for doing that. And I was trying to be kind. But I spent 3 months drawing lines on maps, and I was ready to draw a line on myself. But these are things, most people work and give their best years of their lives to their job, and they don't have fun, and they don't laugh enough, and they're also getting angry. Well, yes, you can get angry, but why get angry when you can use your mind as the last frontier of exploration? I had a phone call a couple weeks ago from Arthur Murray Studio for Dancing, and they offered me free dancing lessons for a couple of weeks, and I claimed, well, I only have one leg. And the gal said, oh, I'm so sorry. I said, but how about pole dancing? Well, she hung up on me. I'm not going to give a one-legged man pole dancing lessons. It's hard to keep from laughing. Or when they sell stuff, telemarketers are still all over the place. They're not supposed to call you if you want to put a clamp on their calls, but they do. They get through, and if they offer something for sale, like Time Magazine, they called a few weeks ago and wanted to sell a subscription. I said, sure, fine. They said, well, what's your name? What's your address? And I said, well, the first week you'd send it to the Ramada Inn in Columbus, Ohio, and then the second week I'll be at the Holiday Inn in Dallas, Texas. Wait a minute, you're going to give me all these motels and hotels? I said, yeah, I'm a traveling salesman. And if you can't send it to me every week at a different address, I don't want the subscription. So he hung up on me. I'm off the list, too. They think you're a little crazy. And that's probably the reason why when I fly, I get a 3-seater. You know how hard it is to get a 3-seater on a plane with only one ticket? Yeah, it's very easy, actually, Ed. Well, you ask for a 3-seater, a 1-seater in the rear of the plane, because they load the plane from the rear first. You get on the rear of that plane, you're a window seat, okay? And then you take about a piece of string, about a foot long, and let it dangle from your lips and your mouth. And the people who are assigned to the other 2 seats, they come along, they see a stranger with a string hanging out of his mouth. And there's something about a stranger with a string that discourages friendship. And they look around the plane. There's lots of empty seats because I always fly off peak, and they'll usually change, but not necessarily. About 75% of them change. And then I've got the 3-seater, so I can sleep when I'm tired, and I can eat when I'm hungry. I don't have to join the pack of sheep that are herded to do this and do that and do this, all within the range of what the stewardess wants to do with the airline rules. And then if they do sit there, and we'll get up to 30,000 feet, I take out a tampon and put it in my nose, one of them, and one in my ear. And then I explain, I have an ear problem at this height, and so I have to put one in my ear. And I have nose problems. I put one in my nose. That does it. I mean, you see a guy with a string in his mouth and a tampon in his nose and one in his ear, you're not going to sit next to it. I wouldn't sit next to it. And away they go, and I've got the 3-seater.
Okay, so when's the last time you did that?
Oh, I did that about 3-4 months ago. Yeah? About 4 months ago I had to do that. Yes, as a matter of fact. And then about the same time I had a lecture at the Goethe Institute in Amsterdam, so I did the same thing, and I had the three-seater all the way over from New York to Amsterdam, back and forth.
Hey, you know what? That reminds me, because you were just honored by Yale University.
Yes, I gave a lecture there. As a matter of fact, it was Josh Foer who wrote Moonwalking with Einstein, and a best-selling book the last year or so, and he was the host for this lecture series they have going there, and Will Baker at the Institute Library. And, you know, it's amazing that people who turned out, there must have been several hundred, but they're all, you know, younger people in the 20s and 30s, and I'm amazed that they can be entertained the way I like to pitch to them, as I do with all these crazy tales, because they've never heard of people like Phil Donahue. He hasn't been
right.
He's still alive, isn't he?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen him around, but I had people fainting in his audience. You know, one of his producers sent me 12 tickets when he moved from Chicago to New York, said welcome him, like welcome Wacken. So I had about 10 people faint every time Phil held out the microphone. They were talking about gay senior citizens, and they had about 12 of them on stage. And as people fainted in the audience, it was a live broadcast, you know, from NBC in New York in the mid-'80s, and Phil cleared the studio and did the rest of the interviews alone with all these gay folks who were over 80. They were all senior citizens, way beyond.
Okay, I remember that because I watched it live. I saw it, you know, and then I saw it on the news that night. Okay, but now my question for you, I got a question for you, okay, is now you say you got these 12 tickets in advance. The guy who gave you the tickets, did he know he was giving these tickets to the famous hoaxer when he was opening up this thing?
He had no clue.
No clue. You fooled him too.
No, he had no clue. And I prefer it that way.
Yeah.
You know? It's much nicer. Don't tell people what you're going to do. Well, Robert Downey Sr., Bobby Jr., you know, he's one of the richest actors in Hollywood now. Well, his father and I have been friends for years, and we attempted to land a Martian off the coast of Asbury, New Jersey, back in, I think it was the late 60s. And we had this guy who was going to pretend to be a Martian because he had no fillings in his teeth, he wasn't circumcised, and he spoke a language that we had people teach him that made no sense at all. It was a combination of Creole and Hebrew and Pig Latin. And we figured that he'll be discovered and he'll be interrogated and it'll create headlines around the world. But when we got out there and had him on the beach and he sent off this rocket up in the air, and we had a hole dug, cinched around the edge to make it look like a rocket ship had dumped him, and he had bruises painted on him like he had a fight with one of the crew, and in pantomime, when the people came down to say, who are you and what are you doing, he let them believe that he was, in fact, a Martian because he was naked. He was completely naked. So they called the sheriff, you know, Asbury Park area, New Jersey, and 3 police cars, sheriff's cars, went up on the boardwalk, and it was about midnight. There was a bar up there where these people came out from, and the sheriff, they all put their lights on Bill, our guy, our Martian. And I heard, we were on the boardwalk filming all this, Bob Downey Sr. and myself and the crew, and I heard the one sheriff say to the other, it's just probably some drunken fairy. And they got in their cars and drove away, and that was the end of our Martian.
It blew the whole hoax, huh? Hey, but it sounds like that your whole life maybe, but in the early life, you were really good friends with a lot of creative, artistic people like Buck Henry and Robert Downey Sr. Who else were you hanging out with back in those days?
Well, of course, there are a lot. There were actually there are a lot of people who came along the way, and I have to stop and hesitate and say, well, Jim Moran was probably one of the greatest hoaxers ever, but he was kind of semi-legitimate. That is, he worked for David Merrick, the Broadway producer, and he used to work and plant stunts and do things to promote the Broadway shows. For example, he had a monkey driving a car in Central Park once, but Jim was actually in the back seat with a periscope and with the controls back that they had rigged in the automobile, but he had a trained monkey at the steering wheel, moving the steering wheel that didn't do anything. So Jim Moran was a great hoaxer, and unfortunately he passed away some years ago, back in the early 90s. But for many years, when Hollywood was at its greatest and Brown Derby was a big hangout in Hollywood, Jim would go in dressed as an Arab sheik and drop glass pearls and jewelry all over the floor of the restaurant and then leave, and the people would scramble. And he told me once he had Errol Flynn and Edward G. Robinson and James Cagney all running over to pick up the fake glass. thinking it was real. He did a lot of stunts like that, and he was very clever, very imaginative, and a hell of a nice guy, too. But we don't have people like that much more because the media has changed. So there used to be 7 or 8 newspapers in New York. And Jim once tried to find a needle in the haystack on Times Square. He had a haystack there and a needle in there, and he got great front-page news in 7 newspapers. But now what do we have? Well, you know, we've got the New York Times, New York Post, the Daily News, and, of course, there's Newsday for Long Island. And they all did front pages. When I had this gal some 2 decades ago pretend to win the New York lottery, she was an actress looking for some fame and fortune. So I had her stage this event where she pretended to win the $35 million jackpot at that time in the state lottery by just saying, I dreamt that I got the magic numbers from Donald Trump.
Okay.
And, you know, and then she was there in the hotel room throwing dollar bills out the window. And the media was all over, and she got the full front page of the New York Post. I mean, you know, the headline, $35 million, and she's single. And Lee, the actress, Lee Chirillo, she went on to work, she did stand-up comedy also at a time when it wasn't terribly popular, especially for women. She went out with 9 Inch Nails and 10,000 Maniacs. She went on tour with some of these rock groups as, you know, the opening act, and she did great and never stopped working. Her boyfriend had ditched her the day before all this happened because she wasn't going anywhere, and he was a bartender, and he said, you're not doing anything, you're not getting jobs, and I'm paying the rent, you know, by being a bartender. Well, you know how much bartenders would steal. I don't have to bring that up because that's another subject. and he tried calling back to her, but there's no way she's going to go near her. So she wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. So it was a great launch for Lee, the actress. And, of course, it was discovered when the real winner came out, because they wait. You see, I think it was a pipe fitter from New Jersey, because they buy all the tickets, and he went into hiding. They go into shock. You know, they had this post-traumatic stress syndrome because they don't know what all this money means. They're making, what, $200, $300 a week maybe, and now suddenly they got $35 million in their hands. What do you do? Where do you go? How do you handle it? So the real guy comes out about 3 or 4 days later, but it didn't matter because Lee had gotten all the publicity, and even Howard Stern went for it. And,
really?
He went for a long interview with her, and, you know, everybody fell for it because, you know, the lottery always has somebody disreputable. And it's like my buddy Paul Hyatt, who's been with me for about 30 years now, and he was losing his apartment and needed a job. He said, why don't you sell one of your kidneys? You got 2, you only need 1. So he advertised it in the newspaper for sale. But it's against the law to sell an organ, and that's ridiculous, too, because the doctors get paid, the airplane that delivers the organ, the hospital gets paid, the hospital gets paid. But the guy who donated, or the gal, you don't get a dime. So he offered to lease it for 99 years. And that way you get around not, you know, he's not breaking the law.
Well, let me ask you this now. When you was trying to sell your kidney and your lung, did you get any real genuine offers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, there was one lady in Germany that wanted to fall over and with a team of doctors. She was very wealthy, and her niece needed a kidney, and she offered whatever he wanted. He said, how about $200,000? She said, no problem. But he wasn't going to go crossing that line either. You know, we did it in order to raise the awareness of the fact that there are not enough organs available for people who need them. There aren't enough lungs, hearts, kidneys. We need people to donate those organs, and 18,000 people a year die in hospitals waiting to get an organ that they can never get because there aren't enough donors. So we did raise the awareness factor because when I do these things, Ed, it eventually... There's somebody, it's not really a party pooper, but somebody says, oh, this has to be this guy, Alan Abel. And when they come to me and say, did you have something to do with this? I usually just say yes, if they get that far. They try to get there. Pete Hamill tried to discover what was behind the animal campaign, never did it. Susan Brownmiller, another writer, she was working for, I think, Life magazine, and was hired to find out what's behind the guy who wants to clothe animals, because people thought there was something criminal about it, there's something deceptive, something illegal, but they couldn't find anything. And what happens then is they say, well, it must be true. This guy's just a certified nut who wants to put clothes on animals. So,
hey, what about when you were on with Tom Snyder? Was he on to you, or you had him fooled?
Well, Tom Snyder, he did expose, I'm sorry, I'll retract that word, Freudian slip. Tom Snyder, he and I had worked together for an advertising campaign in Philadelphia where we both were lecturing for a yearly convention, And I got a nosebleed before I could go on and do my little lecture, so I crawled under the table to, wait till my nosebleed stopped. And he's talking and he's kicking me to come back up and take over, because he only needed about 3 or 4 minutes. And he kicked me so far, and nearly broke one of my ribs. So I was a little annoyed at that and never really forgave him. And I thought, well, I have to do something to kind of fool Tom, just to give him a jab. But, something that's funny and also that has impact enough to get media attention. So I went on the Tomorrow Show, which he was doing every night for an hour on NBC on the network, posing as Omar the Beggar, who taught people how to beg for folding money rather than coins. And Omar the Beggar took off like a grass fire. I didn't realize it would take off as big as it did, just as my euthanasia cruises did when I claimed that people could go out on this boat off of Fort Lauderdale for 3 days and nights of sex and fun and food and dancing, and then the ship tilts and they go down to Davy Jones' locker. And, CBS bought it and had a gal hound me for our interview, and then she wanted to go along on one of the journeys of the Last Supper. That was the name of the ship, of course. And I there was no ship. There was nothing. It was all imaginary. And I said, we only sell one-way tickets, Beth. It's $500 one way. You can't come back. She terminated the interview.
Okay, but wait a second. Back to Tom Snyder. You're saying that when you first went on as Omar the Beggar, he was in on it with you.
Yeah, well, Omar the Beggar lasted for about 4 or 5 years. Then Time Magazine finally discovered that it was a joke, and they ran the revelation, and the News and World Today also discovered that I was behind it. But for about 3 or 4 years, there were people falling for it. In fact, one writer, his name was N.R. Kleinfeld, who writes for the New York Times, he came to one of my fake classes where I had friends sit there, and I had a hood over my head, and as Omar lecturing, and that's when I went on Tom Snyder Show with the hood, and I had a private guard, and he had $101 bills and then $100 bill around that wad, and he pulled it out at one point and offered to loan money to Tom if he needed it. And of course, he sees this big wad of bills and doesn't realize there's $101 bills and only one $100 bill. And no, he said, no, I don't do things like that. But Tom was fooled for the full hour, and Irma Bombeck was in the wings. She was supposed to do the second half hour, but she never got on because Tom was getting so many phone calls and so much publicity over Omar the Beggar. Gannett newspapers ran a full page one headline story about school for panhandlers, because these friends of mine and others who were my associates, particularly Paul Hyatt, who's a fantastic actor and improviser, and he was in on all these schemes from day one. They were fooled by the authenticity of what we were doing, because it's real. If you can keep a straight face, that's what you got to do it. But you don't dare break the spell. If you're going to break the spell, that's going to spoil it.
Okay, but let me ask you this real quick, because you used to wear that same black hood. You were doing different characters, different hoaxes, but that was the same exact black hood, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I would wear the same black hood, and then, you know what, the story is too good to ignore. And this is back in the day before computers and before instant recognition. Like I said, you could find in 2 seconds who's where and what, and how you know their whole life history. So I got away with it, and it surprised me because Kleinfeld, we were having lunch at the Cattleman Restaurant over on 45th Street. I think it's not there anymore. I think Morton's is there now in New York City. And he didn't believe me that Omar had this school for beggars, even though he had sat through a class and taken notes. And at that time, he was freelancing to the Wall Street Journal and other papers. And we went out of the restaurant, and he said, Omar, I don't know whether I could believe you or not. There was a penny on the sidewalk. As we were talking, I picked up the penny and put it in my pocket, and he says, I believe you. And then he wrote this very castigating editorial just destroying Omar the Beggar as being the lowest form of creature ever for doing what he's doing to human beings. But I had a good story. You're out of work, you need money, you got to pay the rent, you got to pay the mortgage. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? You can't just hold out your hand. So you got to have some kind of a ploy. You got to be inventive. You got to put ketchup on your sleeve, pretend you've been mugged, and you're on your way to the hospital and you need folding money, and you'd get it. Nobody's going to give you 50 or 75 cents to get to the hospital. They know it costs maybe $5 or $10. And I do on like that rapid fire so nobody could interrupt me. And so I did a lot of network shows, and particularly the news shows. They went for it, hook, line, and sinkers. It's such a logical, good story, and especially during the time I was doing this, in the 60s there when New York was in trouble financially, and other cities too, and panhandling for bucks instead of change seemed like a very, very good way to save yourself.
Okay, listen, we're on. Okay, I gotta read some ads, my friend. We're on with Alan Abel, who's a hero of mine. He's a famous hoaxer from back in New York City. He's done international hoaxes all around the world. You can find his website called Abel Raises Cain, and you can buy his documentary. This guy did an incredible documentary, the story of his life. A lot of the stuff he's saying right now, he's kind of going too fast. He's brushing past stuff. But a fascinating life. He's met Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman was fast. Andy Kaufman could recognize genius, and he recognized Alan Abel when he saw him. Okay, but tonight's show is brought to you by Pacific West Bamboo, 503-839-8126. Demroots at oppermail.com. You can find their website on Facebook at Pacific West Bamboo. They're your #1 source for timber construction and craft-grade bamboo poles, plants, and products. They specialize in eco-friendly, reclaimed wood products for the home, garden, located in Portland, Oregon. They've been servicing the Northwest for over 10 years. They can be reached at 503-839-8126, and they can and do ship nationwide. Then we got Mike Gray from infinityhomeplans.com. Now check out infinityhomeplans.com. Home plans and design services, your resource for 3D and 2D draftsman services. They offer a multitude of products, including stock home plans, 2D digital drawings, sets, 3D models, renderings, and more. That's infinityhomeplans.com. Check them out. Ask for Mike Gray. Okay, tonight we're simulcasting on hazyradio.com, we're on freedomslips.com, and we're also on cjmarsradio.com. And don't forget to support. Freedomslips.com is a listener-sponsored station, so if you like what you're hearing, please visit the website, freedomslips.com, find the donate button, and click on that to keep the station supported. Okay, now we have a new sponsor, which is a jewelry production cooperative of village women in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero. For the most part, the family members of these women are in the United States in the status of illegal workers, and they have now published a book of authentic handwritten letters addressed to their husbands, brothers, fathers, uncles, and boyfriends. These passionate letters have been translated to English, so everybody can get a feeling for who these women really are. Maybe it will be surprising to some listeners that every letter in one way or another begs the loved ones to come back to return to Mexico, to their hometown, to the family who misses them and loves them. And you can find their letters if you just Google modern Mexican women. You can find, New World Mexican women. That's what you have to Google, and you can find a link to this book. But if you go to Revolucion, revolucion.mx/wetback-world. Okay, you can find a link to their books. It's only $19 for this book, and you can find them. And they also have a webinar on how to make this jewelry, and I think they have a book of how to make this jewelry as well. But we're here tonight with Mr. Alan Abel, a famous genius from the New York area, doing all this great stuff. Alan, are you there?
I'm still here, Ed. Very much so.
Okay, great. I'm having some audio problems here. People say they can't hear me. I'm fiddling with everything. They're trying to make it work. But you're a pro, and you're definitely carrying the show for me, my friend, and I appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, so one of the things we were talking about is Omar the beggar. Okay, now what about, how about you give some credit to your wife? I know your wife was involved in the whole running for president, Yetta from the Bronx.
Yes. She posed as Yetta Bronstein, running for president, and she never was seen by anybody because she looked more like Natalie Wood than she did Molly Pecan. So she couldn't play that role visually, but she had the voice because she did voices, and she was really terrific playing voices as an actress. And we're working on a CD right now that's similar to what Paul Weston did with Joe Stafford, where she sang out of tune. Do you remember that album that was a big success many years ago? We're taking all the popular music of the 40s, and we're doing the song as a duo, where I'm singing out of tune and she plays the role of chicken. Are you there, Jeannie?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll give you just 4 bars of this. And when I hear you call so softly to me, I don't hear a call at all. I hear a rhapsody. That's all you get. That's all you get for nothing, Dan.
Well, okay, and what are you going to do? You're going to put out an album or a CD?
Well, what we're going to do, we're going to take about 25 songs and just do the first 4 or 5 measures. You know, that's considered fair comment, so you don't have to get into licensing and cross that copyright license line that they have. You know, it's running rampant right now. Everything's free on the internet. You get all the songs, you get all the teasers and whatnot, and you get the mixes and you know, samples that are being taken. The whole copyright scene is just in it's in disloyal revolt of some kind. But it'll be straightened out because they changed the copyright law, and I think they gave it back to the authors after 75 years or for 75 years more. I don't know. It's too complicated. You need to be a lawyer to carry on these things. And I don't want to get into law, although I thought about it for a while in college, you know, studying law, because my debate coach, Bill Saxby, who later became Attorney General and then ambassador to India, he was always prompting me, come on, study law, and you can do it. No, but I work as a pro se. You know, I sued the government once to examine their books and records because they called me in for a taxpayer audit and found I only owed about $30 and said, forget it, after all day poring over my books and records. So I filed suit to have the government bring all their canceled checks to my house. And, of course, they fought it tooth and nail. This was back in the early 70s, and they had a big law firm that handled the Career Brothers from New York, and they deposed me every day for about 6 hours. What is this guy trying to do? Well, they said it would take 12 freight cars, just for the Pentagon checks alone. And there's no way they're going to let me spot check their checks by having them bring all their canceled checks to my house. But the next year, following that, I was called in for another audit. And the two same agents were down there at Church Street, I think, where the office was with IRS. They waved me back, and they had a donut and coffee for me. Said, go home. It's a mistake. If the accountant doesn't cross the T or dot the I, you know, you get called in for an audit. And in this case, they did call me in for some mistake that the accountant made. And then they would realize that I was the guy who created all this mayhem, you know, with the government's checks, that they didn't want it to go near me. And they're not accountants, you know, they're not CPAs. The guys who examine the records from IRS, they're bookkeepers. So what do they know? You know, they don't have the background, they don't have the education, they don't have the degrees that qualify them really to be real snoopers. Well, you know what that is because you're a private eye in your own right. I know all about you, Ed.
I'm sure you do, my friend. Hey, so you were talking about the internet before. Are you on the internet? Do you go online? Do you see these modern day guys who try and do hoaxes?
Oh yes. I go online. I'm very much a part of it. I have probably thousands of people I can know about my escapades, and they send me emails, and they know when my birthday is. My goodness, and send me birthday greetings and compliments. And thousands of people have actually viewed daughter Jennifer's, documentary Abel raises Cain. And in fact, I'm thinking of making one on her called Daughter Dearest. But she's been a delightful person. Our best production, she and Jeff, her husband, they've been married now for 3 years, and they have a little baby boy who's going to be 2 years old. And I met Jeff in New York when he was working for the National Enquirer, when they had a syndicated TV show, and they were discovering the various spoofs and hoaxes. And they came to me when I was interviewed on CNN posing as a plastic surgeon for pets, and I claimed that I could make your dog's face look like the owner, and vice versa.
Okay, I think I missed that one.
Yeah, CNN bought it. I think the gal's name was Pilgrim. Miss Pilgrim interviewed me for that segment, and of course then it was exposed a few days later on page 6 in the New York Post. And at that point, the photographer who had interviewed me, Jeff, was in New York. We went out to dinner, and my daughter was in California working for a film company. And I said, why don't you two guys get together? You know, you're both 26 years old, and you're both good-looking and intelligent, and you have a great sense of humor. Well, you know how the kids are. I say kids, 26 years old. They don't want the old guy, the old man, right, fix them up. They don't want a blind date. But I harassed Jennifer, our daughter, for 3 months until she finally said, I'm going to call this guy, because he was then transferred to Los Angeles, and I'll spend 1 hour with him, and that's it. Well, they spent an hour, and then they stayed till closing in this coffee shop in Hollywood, and then they got together that next day, and they've been together ever since, got married, and have a baby boy. And that's the end of that story. But I feel very good about that because Jennifer was really our best production. Although my wife and I, we did a movie, with Buck Henry called "Is There Sex After Death?" I don't know if you're aware of that, Ed.
I saw it, yeah.
You saw a little clip of that.
The clip of it, yeah.
Oh yes, well we made that movie. It was a satire on sex. It was not dirty. It was not pornographic. If you get aroused from it, you would need therapy right away. It's strictly a comedy, and Buck Henry was at his best. I mean, he is hilarious in this film, and I worked with him in it as an interview, and as supposedly as Dr. Rogers, who had a sex clinic, making fun of Masters and Johnson at that time in the early 70s. I had a bloody lip every session that I had with Buck because he is so funny and so marvelous in his improv. So we did that movie, and it was very successful. Vincent Canby was in the Playboy Theater on 57th Street in New York when we had opening night, 600 seats all sold out. And then the film burned up on the screen because the projectionist, who was 88 years old, didn't know how to thread the film properly and got the sprocket teeth out of line with the film sprockets, and the film jammed, and with the bulb 1200 volts, or 1200 degrees, however hot that bulb was supposed to be. Yeah, right. The film was burning up. And who was in the audience at the time was Vincent Canby, the dean critic, a first-line critic with the New York Times. He didn't know, and I didn't know that he was there. He knew he was there, of course, but he wasn't going to review the film, but I had to run up on stage and entertain the audience for 20 minutes until Jeannie, my wife, who was the film editor, went into the booth, kicked the old-time projectionist out, and took over, rethreading the film, while I kept the audience at bay, offering free vasectomy operations at intermission to the first 100 men, and telling them about the sex life of the dinosaur, because I had been on radio talking about that a few days earlier. So they had no sex life. The dinosaur, that's why they became extinct. And cavemen used to tie a string at the base of the penis to remember something, but they remembered only that it was very painful. So, talking about things like that.
Okay, wait a second. But didn't you also to stage a feminist protest in front of your own movie?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Okay, well, I saw in your documentary that you had staged some feminist protesting in front of your movie.
Oh yes. I hired ladies to protest the movie because it was supposedly sacrilegious and it was dirty, and it wasn't that. And then when we opened the first day that we did there at the Playboy Theater, I hired 100 people to stand in line for 6 hours. So we had 100 people standing in line on crosstown traffic, 57th Street, and we sold out all 600 seats. Because when people see a line in front of a theater for any event, they know it must be very popular. I mean, I'm sure Lady Gaga gets around the block lines, as Madonna does. But this is long before those days when they have all the hype and millions of dollars to spend for publicity. We had literally nothing to spend. We used imagination again and a few little gimmicks, little tricks to the trade, but nothing physical, nothing criminal, none of the ideas, none of the stunts that we do going to hurt anyone, is going to get anyone to sue us, although we did get the threat of one lawsuit when we interviewed a young lady with a dog in Is There Sex After Death, and the dog was wearing the same costume the young lady was. So when she got paid for the interview, she came and wanted to collect for the dog. But I said, we can't pay the dog, because he's a dog. And so she filed a small claims court summons saying, I want to get at least a couple $100 for the dog. And I claimed that we were doing a film about sex, and therefore I would bring our dog to court, and he's a male, and we have a female dog, and we'll have them mate to make sure her dog is sexy. And she backed away at that point and dropped the suit. So, you have to fight fire with fire sometimes. And I enjoy that because I do get emails from people, sometimes serious type things, like, of course, dropping a Martian out of the sky is not that serious, or the Loch Ness Monster. We couldn't do that because Max Sackon, my backer, had died, and we couldn't afford to rent the helicopter and take a crew to Scotland and all that kind of stuff. So the Loch Ness Monster, and then the monster was discovered to have been a great big hoax. Subsequent years, the guys who had created it came forth and said, we did this and we made a joke out of it, and until it was. So that was the end of that. But I'm serious about some things like our Patriot Act. Remember when we had the color code that there's going to be an attack?
Yes.
Go from green to yellow. But what about all the colorblind people? They wouldn't recognize the red. And this is why I think they changed the act, because I protested in Washington with a few people about that color code. Now they have something else going for them. I don't know what it is, but it's not the color code anymore.
Yeah, I think they just gave up.
But well, and it's the same with our national debt. When I was up in New Hampshire watching the documentary being screened at a film festival, I think it's called S.N.A, S-N-O-B, somewhat north of Boston, there were, in 2008, all of the Barack Obama followers were there, and there were about several hundred college-age kids, and they're not kids, they're people. Sorry about that, kids. But they go in this theater watching the documentary. They loved it, and afterwards, during the Q&A, one of them said, "What can you do to help, our president-elect Barack Obama, who's running for president? How can we get more votes for him?" And I said, "Well, you can solve the national debt by releasing 2.2 million people who are incarcerated, because it costs over $100,000 for each and every prisoner to be rehabilitated, to be guarded, to be housed, to be fed, to be entertained, and so on and so forth. And if we released them all and gave each one 7 days in which to be adopted by an American family or put to sleep, then we'd erase that debt of having to pay for it. And the ones who are hardcore prisoners would go to Alcatraz." Well, everybody laughed. They didn't think, well, that's not a very good idea. Well, of course, they enjoyed it. They enjoyed, again, the entertainment factor. And I tried to poke fun and laugh at all the indignities and craziness that goes on. But as far as the taxes are concerned, or releasing people, I have presented a fat tax, where people could weigh in.
That's right, I remember it.
Pardon?
That's right, I remember. I'm laughing over here.
Yeah. Instead of the income tax, why not a fat tax? People can weigh in and pay $5 a pound every year. Go to the post office, you get on the scale, and you take all the members of the family, including 2 pets, and you each pay $5 a pound. And that's your tax. Forget about what you earn income. And you keep everything, but you pay by your body weight. And the government would generate more money. Uncle Sam would generate about $350 million, even more. And for each person who weighs in and so forth, they would give a glowing amount of money to the government to have in their treasury. But, new ideas like that are too revolutionary, and they don't want it. But it's okay, because there's plenty of targets out there. Remember the Iran-Contra affair when, who was it? Ali
Ron
Akbar.
Reagan. Ronald Reagan.
Ali Akbar, and Johnny, was president of Iran, and his bastard son, Mehdi Bahramani, was a playboy over in the United States, playing around with the Playboy clubs and, running around with all these young ladies. And the old guy who was president of Iran wanted him back home, and he couldn't find him because he disappeared. So I found a guy on the subway who could speak Farsi and looked a bit like, well, an Iranian, I guess. And he posed as him. We made page 1 of the New York Times. Mehdi Bahramani was in New York, and he's planning to give $4 million back to the U.S. government that he earned in commissions for the Iran-Contra affair. And it made news around the world, but it petered away, but nobody could find him, and nobody knew where he was. And the Iranian embassy in New York, they were going crazy trying to figure out who was behind this hoax and why it was all happening. And you're the first, and people out there listening was the first to know about this, because it's never been resolved, but maybe someday. We'll probably do another book. I'm working on several of them at this time, of course, to explain and talk about all the stuff that's been done. Hell, we'll get some mileage out of it. There's always, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's usually an oncoming train. So you have to be so careful about things like that. You understand?
Yeah, I do. We got a break coming up soon, so we got about 4 minutes. Why don't you tell us about the time you impersonated Howard Hughes?
Oh, gosh, Howard Hughes. Well, Howard Hughes, what had happened, I was giving a lecture at the University of British Columbia, and Howard Hughes was staying at the Bayshore Inn, which is the hotel there, and he had taken over the whole top floor, and I had the floor room underneath where I could hear all the partying and the noise and carrying on upstairs. And he was going back into the movie business then. This was back in 1970. Gosh, how many years ago is that? So I thought, well, he's going back to the movie business. I have a script for an idea for a movie. I'll tie a string to it and throw it up on his balcony with a note, "Let's have lunch. I'll wear gloves." You know how hard it was. And I threw the script up, string tied to it. Next morning I wake up, and only I left the string. The script was gone, but I just had the string. So I never did actually get to reach Howard Hughes. But when I got back to New York, I thought, well, I'll smoke him out. So I got myself wrapped in bandages and claimed I was going to be frozen through cryogenics as Howard Hughes and come back when the stock market was higher. And then I had friends in Vancouver send, the letters and wires and telegrams at that time to the media to meet Howard Hughes for 20 minutes at the Hotel Regis. Once again, my backer, Max Sackheim, put up the money, and sure enough, we had prison guards, and we had, about 100 and some reporters show up for that occasion.
Okay, Alan, this is that long break I was telling you about. We're going to take that nice long break so you can get a drink, and we'll be right back after this with Alan Abel. Back with the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. We're live here on freedomslips.com, Revolution Radio, cjmarsradio.com, and hazyradio.com. We're also on 365 Live. And we have with us tonight a hero of mine, Alan Abel, who's a performance artist genius. There's no doubt. His website is Abel Raises Cain. And you can find a link there to purchase his documentary about his life. And he's written about 10 books and some other items there. So, hey, Alan, aren't you also selling some memorabilia?
Well, I'm trying to sell all my memorabilia for somebody who could donate it to a college.
Yeah.
Well, I almost got it sold to Brown University, but they voted against it. There were, the Board of Regents, they didn't want to go put money for it. And my alma mater, which is the Ohio State University, they want it for free. They want it donated. I can't afford to donate it. And, they said, well, you can get a tax write-off. And I said, what's that? I don't know what you're talking about. And, of course, they figured, well, maybe they'll get it after I'm gone and the Grim Reaper comes along. But I died, on January 2nd, 1980. And I had my obituary in the New York Times. I got 8 inches of space, 2 inches more than the guy who invented the six-pack, who died the same day, and he didn't come back. And I was resurrected a few days later, and I had about 150 members of the media at the news conference, because the fact that I died with 8 inches of space didn't mean that much, although it's nice to be in the index of the New York Times and to have a very lovely obituary. Oh, that was beautiful. And I pulled that off because, I was disappointed with the lawyers from Universal at the time. They were thinking about making a movie. I had people over the years who wanted to make a movie, starting with Cary Grant. He was accidentally in a screening room when we were making Is There Sex After Death, and we were screening for some distributors in 1970. And Cary was in there with his partner for Fabergé in the wrong screening room. They worked together on some, I guess, very cosmetic line they were developing. And I heard Cary Grant's laughter when the lights went up with about 30 people in that room. I realized it was Cary Grant, and we were still editing the film. I said, would you do a cameo, Cary? And he said, well, what would you have in mind? I said, well, at that time, The Galloping Gourmet was a popular TV show with this chef who showed people cooking ideas, such as we have all over the cooking network today. And you could pretend that you could show ladies how to make a dildo with odds and ends around the kitchen. And he loved the idea. But I could see George, his partner, was frowning. But it didn't go through. And then Cary and I talked by phone a few times after that, and he thought about doing a movie based on my adventures. But then, he got busy with other projects. That was in the 70s. And during the 80s, Woody Allen sent me a letter, said he'd be interested in the story of my life for a movie, and it didn't go to fruition when he said later in one of his correspondence that he couldn't get the hook. He couldn't find the hook to put it all together. And in the 90s, it was Dustin Hoffman who wanted the same idea put into a film, and he said, I don't know if I could get the hook. I keep mentioning the hook because in between all this time, a chap named Martin Ritt said he'd like to do a film. He did HUD and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Marty was good friends with Paul Newman, and they did a lot of movies together. And fortunately, Marty passed away, but he already had Jack Lemmon lined up to do the movie, and Carl Reiner was going to direct, and he would produce for Paramount Pictures, and they optioned it through Paramount for about a year. But it never happened. Again, at the final announcement, they couldn't get the hook. But who got the hook? Jenny Abel and Jeff, her partner, husband. they found the hook. They spent about 8 years working on Abel raises Cain, and it's won first prize best documentary in 12 different film festivals. And I've been lucky to go to these festivals and go to the Q&A sessions like the one in Denmark, Copenhagen. There were about 500 filmmakers there, and Jenny and Jeff won first prize for Abel raises Cain. I complained in Denmark when they presented the award that I would take back for Jenny and Jeff. It was a beautiful sculpture by a very well-known Danish sculptor, and in fact, I can't remember or even pronounce his name if I did. And I said, I accept this for the filmmakers with disappointment. They don't need one more trophy. They have 12 already. They don't need another doorstop. How much is this worth? I'm going to a pawn shop tomorrow and have it appraised. And, of course, they laughed at that. And then I complained about their bicycles, because everyone rides bicycles in Denmark, and they're small bicycle seats. So I said, is there collusion between the manufacturers of those bicycle seats and Preparation H? There has to be. I mean, what about a motorcycle bicycle seat? They're nice and comfortable.
Alan, let me ask you a question. Did your daughter do any other films? Because I watched the movie, and it's an excellent movie. And I saw it first about 5 years ago before I had the show. And it's an honor to have you, because I really enjoyed it. And I enjoy your life. I look up to you. And it really is an honor to have you on the show, man. You're a great guest. I love you. Did your daughter do any other films?
Well, no. She got married with Jeff, who was in filmmaking and video making, so forth. And they decided to have a child, which they have this lovely little boy, this 2-year-old. His name is Jalen, and he's already become quite a good little drummer. And I have trained him to only answer 2 words for so far, because he's not quite 2 years old. And, his language is limited. And what I do is when there's a crowd around, I ask him, I say, Jalen, is there hope? And his response very definitively is, oh, no.
I love it.
And he says it with such inflection and beauty. And he's such a cute little boy. And everyone roars with delight. No, there's no hope.
I love it, man. You're a real artist, Alan. You're a real artist. Oh, now,
no clue.
When you fooled the New York Times with your obit, now they had to be looking for that. They had to be. How'd you pull that off?
Well, that was interesting to stage, because what had happened, I'd been on the coast, and the Universal movie studio lawyers were in the elevator, not realizing I was going up for a meeting with them. It was crowded, and one of them said, "Why don't we hold off on trying to negotiate a contract? Wait till this guy Abel, passes on, then we can buy the rights for peanuts from his estate." And then they got off the elevator, and I stayed on, went on home back to the hotel, back to New York. And I was really discouraged and very decimated by this attitude of, well, we'll wait till he passes on. Come on, that's not the way to do it. So I thought, well, yeah, that's the way to do it. So I got my friends together, and I had a friend of mine out in Orem, Utah. I lived in a trailer and couldn't afford to have a phone. I offered to put the telephone in and pay for it if he would put it in as, I think he used the name Paul's Funeral Home, which is very unusual to have someone with the first name Paul's Funeral Home. And he did. The phone company doesn't check on things like that. It didn't then. Now they would, of course. And then I had the All Souls Church in New York reserved for the wake, and I decided that I would expire, and news came that I did, that I was going out to Robert Redford's ski lodge out there at Sundance, and they found my skis in the form of a cross, and Paul's Funeral Home verified that they were taking care of the body, and the New York Times decided to run the obit. Of course, we sent a friend of mine, actress, down there posing as my widow, because Jeannie wouldn't go. She said, no, I'm not going to play that game. She went away on holiday with Jenny, who was then about, at that time, 8 years old. It was 1980. And the Times, close to deadline, and with the verification from the All Souls Church and Paul's Funeral Home out there in Orem, Utah, they ran the obituary. Now, when the expose came, when I resurfaced a few days later, wow, that made the news. Oh, my goodness. And the news conference at that time was at the Biltmore Hotel, which I don't think exists in New York anymore. It might be the Roosevelt now. They changed the name. And we had over 100 reporters show up for my Q&A section as to what happened and why I did it. And there were 4 obituary writers from the New York Times sitting in the front row, and they all wore the same pinstripe suits and shirts and ties, and they all had the same stoic poker faces, and they never laughed at anything. And I had the room jumping with joy. They were hysterical. These guys loved it. But the Times guys didn't. They were sore apples. They had no way, no pleasure. They're going to respond humorously. And I explained, the circumstances that led up to this, and I said it was done to me. I didn't do it to somebody else. And then I found out that the people I thought would care the most cared the least, and vice versa. In fact, there was an aunt in Indianapolis I never knew I had who rented a Ryder truck and drove all the way from Indiana to Connecticut to pick up all the furniture I always promised her. Yeah, really. So when you got to the house, there's a guard there, of course. Jeannie and Jenna were away on a holiday, and the guard wouldn't let her come in, and she was angry as could be, and she stormed back to her truck and drove back to Indiana empty-handed. Then when I surfaced, she found out she was outraged, and even to this day, she's still alive and still outraged, angry, thinking I pulled the stunt off just to embarrass her. Can you believe that?
I can't believe it. I know. I think we all know that feeling, my friend. Okay, but now, Andy Kaufman.
Oh, Andy Kaufman was a great friend.
Yeah.
We had 2 years together in New York dinners. He'd come into the city, and he was a great guy to sit and talk for hours. And he loved to walk down Broadway, and I'd walk with him. But when he'd say we're going to have dinner at 6 o'clock at the Hilton, it was usually 9 o'clock because we'd sit 3 hours out on the sidewalks where he signed autographs and posed for photos. And he loved to play conga drums. And one time when he came to New York, we sat in with this little rock band that was playing there for their hat and about 6 musicians, and they had conga drums and a drum set. I sat down at the drum set because I play, and Andy got the congas, and pretty soon we had 200 people there, and the hat they had out front was overflowing with dollars and $5 and $10 and $20 bills. The guys took in about $1,000. We played for about a half hour. That's all it took to just fill that hat with money.
Okay, wait, you know something? Wait, that's really interesting because here both you guys are real performance artist geniuses, way ahead of your time, both of you, and you were both drummers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I played much better than Andy.
Okay, good.
Well, I'd been out, on the road with Sauter Finnegan, the jazz band. I don't know if people remember names like that. Ed Sauter and Bill Finnegan had great jazz bands. They used to write all the arrangements for Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and they formed a big band with 22 musicians, including a harp and a tuba and 8 reeds and 8 brass, and it was a beautiful sound. Very great band. But that was, again, during a period of time when big bands were in vogue and not anymore.
Okay, but Andy Kaufman was fascinated by you hoaxing your death.
Oh, yeah, well, he called me after I died, and I mean, I didn't answer the phone. He left a message to call back immediately. It was urgent, and I did, from a safe phone line, I called back. But this was, again, before the computer age, and there wasn't immediate contact with anybody. So I got back to Andy, and he kept me on the phone for about 3 or 4 hours. He had to know every detail how I pulled it off. And I told him, and I explained it to him, and he loved it. He was laughing hysterically. I said historically, that was a Freudian slip.
Yeah.
He still may come back. I leave the door open a crack. And then I teased Andy, and I said, Andy, you've done nothing for society. You work for Taxi, you're a hit star, you're a big cheese, you get $10,000 a week for your part in that role, as Latka. And what have you done for society that you could say is noteworthy? And he was upset by that. He said, well, all right, I'll tell you what happened last year. Sunday night, I get a call from this mother in Mattoon, Illinois. Her daughter's in the hospital, a high school kid dying of leukemia, and she's a great fan of mine, and she wanted to talk to me before she died. And so that Sunday night, I flew out to Chicago, rented a car in a snowstorm, and drove to Mattoon and stayed up with her for 2 nights until she passed away. And I didn't show up for the first reading on Monday of the new script of Taxi, and everybody's calling the hospitals and the police. I told nobody what I did. And then when I got back, they fined me. In addition to $10,000 I lost in salary, paid another $10,000 fine for, leaving the show and not telling them. And he said, I did that for this young lady. I didn't even know her, and she was beautiful. And I said, okay, I'm sorry. And I thought, well, maybe he's faking. Maybe he's making that up. But he wasn't, because when I did a fundraiser for Yvonne Lendl for his Cancer Society in Greenwich, Connecticut, Yvonne, the great tennis player. And at that fundraiser, there was a man who came up afterwards, because I made up this whole fake history about Yvonne Lendl being Yvonne the Hun, from Attila the Hun, descendant because he never smiled when he was on camera. He was a great player in tennis court, but he never smiled. I had this whole fake history of his life. He grew up without smiling. And this man came up, and he had worked for the production company that produced Taxi, and he said he remembered that week, that night, that Andy failed to show up on Monday, Tuesday, and so on. Pardon me. And he verified and corroborated the fact that it was a true story. So Andy did that sort of thing. But other than that, Andy was a great talent besides its mud wrestling and taking people to get cookies and milk after one of his stand-up concerts at Carnegie Hall and so on. He did a lot of stunts, and he liked the outrageous stuff that I was doing. In fact, I have in a back file, I started writing it, My Dinner with Andy Kaufman, which is just a two-part play that two people could perform that would tell about all of the events and stuff that we talked about, Andy and I, when we had dinners together, and I kept a record of it. And so I started to work on a two-man play that still needed some sort of completion. I haven't quite gotten around to it. You know, there's so many projects on back burners, Ed. I'm just overwhelmed, kind of. And I like to have a little space and do some little things here and there, something different. And I find that there's still ideas. And remember, if life is not a great adventure, it is nothing. And Helen Keller uttered those words, and she was both blind and deaf from birth.
It seems to me, though, that a movie or a play, like you said, about these two great minds. Like, what else did you guys talk about? Right.
Well, I have to tell you about one incident with Jennifer when she embarrassed me, because I think I joked that I'm going to do one. Her documentary with Jeff is a great embarrassment, I say, and it's only interested for those people who are perhaps fruitcakes in their own right and so forth. But Jennifer, I took her up to Canada once when she was about 7 or 8 years old, and a joke going around grade school was, where does the Lone Ranger take his garbage? And the producer, Paul Soules of this talk show, said I could bring this little girl and she could tell the joke at the end of the show. And you say, well, where did the Lone Ranger take his garbage? And then you say, to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, 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 to the dump, to the dump. And that was going to be her little joke. Well, we got on the show, and Lorne Michaels was on this panel discussion, as I was with Elaine Boozler, the comedian, and Fran Lebowitz, who wrote Metropolitan Life. And we were having this panel discussion with Paul Soules, the producer, director, performer. And we ran out of time. It was a 500-audience show all across Canada. And I could see Paul waving to Jennifer in the wings, and the credits were rolling on the monitor. So he said, Jennifer, come out and tell the joke. We only have 10 seconds. So she runs out real quick to the mic and says, where does the Lone Ranger take a dump? And the show ended, and the audience went hysterical. Just went bananas. They roared, and I stood there, red-faced. I kept saying, garbage, garbage, garbage.
But it turned out better, though.
Yeah, it did, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, the audience just went crazy. Well, you know, you can whip audiences up. I attended a Bill Maher audience at the Virginia Theater in New York about 8 or 9 years ago, and he did a one-man show, 90 minutes nonstop. And then he had an open mic at the end, and he had 1,500 people in the theater, and I went up to the open mic, managed to be first by luck, and I said, Bill, I know you have shown great prowess with your relationships with the opposite sex, and maybe you could answer a question for a man who's a bit older than you are, and is it dangerous to have a wet dream under an electric blanket? And he stood there, Jack Benny style, posing. That audience went crazy, laughing in waves. People were explaining it to others, and others were explaining it to others, and soon that theater was just laughing. Actually, for 3 or 4 minutes, apparently, they didn't stop laughing, and then nobody else got a chance to ask a question.
Hey, real quick, back to your daughter, though. Did I interrupt you? I'm sorry.
Excuse me?
Did I interrupt you?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I apologize.
That's all right. You're allowed to do that. It's your show, Ed. I think it's your show.
Yeah.
Is it?
I know. Listen, I'm in awe. Okay, I'm out here. I really am.
Okay.
But back to your daughter, though, right? When she was a little kid, did you go to like career day at school and try and explain to the kids what you did for a living?
Oh, I tried to. Well, you saw that in the documentary where Jennifer did a very, very eloquent job of writing a voiceover script to explain her old man. And, you know, I didn't have to. I did to take her on a couple of other instances where a chap named Bill Boggs had a daily talk show in New York on WNEW television at that time, and I think it's changed over to something else. But I had Jennifer at the age of 4 or 5 posing as a young lady eating hare that was high in protein. So I had a hare sandwich that supposedly could taste just as good as a hamburger, and she wouldn't eat it. We had practiced that she was going to eat it, but no. And when it came time for her to eat the sandwich on the air with Bill Boggs, the host, she turned her head away and said, "No, Daddy, I'm not going to take a bite."
Okay, I used to watch you on Bill Boggs all the time. Now, but you went on there quite a bit, though, and he was in on it.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Jennifer was a delightful young lady. It's our only daughter, and when she wanted a playhouse, I found an old caboose from the Pacific Railroad. This is the Blue Pacific chain, I think. It was old and it was abandoned, and they decided to let me have it. So I did a bit of lecturing for one of their dinners up there in Toronto, and the caboose was rolled on the tracks down to, at that time we were living in Westport, Connecticut, but we had to get a permit from the zoning commission to put a 100-year-old caboose in our backyard. And I knew they would turn it down because Paul Newman, who lived in Westport, had tried to get a dance studio built for his wife, and they turned him down. They wouldn't allow him to build a dance studio on this property. But I told Jennifer, who was then, I guess she was about 4 or 5 years old, that we'd go before the zoning commission, and if they turned her down, what would she do? And she said, "I'll cry." And I said, "Well, don't stop, okay? If I say stop, that means go." "Oh, yeah, we'll play that game." So sure enough, these 4 mafioso types said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "We want a playhouse that looks like a caboose put in our backyard." "Oh, it looks like a caboose? How much does it weigh?" I said, 30 tons. "Oh, but it is a caboose." I said, "No, let's not get into semantics," and I'm not anti-semantic. But they insisted that you couldn't have that caboose because it just wasn't going to go for what Westport was all about. And then Jennifer, I said, "You can't have it," and she started crying. And she kept crying and crying, and meantime, these 4 guys are embarrassed, and people out in the hall, mostly contractors, are waiting, and they hear a little girl crying, and I said, "Stop," and she wouldn't stop, and so the 4 guys had a huddle, and they told her that if she would stop crying, she could have the caboose. And then she stopped on a dime, and they gave us permit to have the caboose, and I warned her outside later. I said, "You stop too quickly, you have to fade out." So I had to teach her about fading. When you're crying and someone says stop, you can't stop immediately. You have to gradually do it slowly, and then you stop. That was her first acting lesson, by the way.
Has she ever tried to do any hoaxes on her own?
No, not yet.
No.
No, it's really great because she's a really a wonderful person, and she's been a delightful mother to that little boy that's Jalen. And we went out on a tour a year ago for a group that had I think you call it 501c nonprofit agency, but that booked award-winning films on tours of colleges and museums. It's been 2 weeks going down south, and they had a whole itinerary booked out. And Jennifer and Jeff and Jalen, who was then a year old, and Jeannie and I, we all went on the tour, and then we all did the Q&A. Of course, Jalen was only a year old, so he couldn't do it. But we had some great times with audiences all through Mississippi and New York State, and we were also over down into New Jersey and colleges and museums. And it's wonderful to see people who were never alive when all of these stunts were instigated and performed, who could relate to them with great pleasure and laughter. They loved it. They were just marvelous audiences. So the point is that the documentary has legs forever. And I think it's a wonderful legacy for the daughter, Jennifer, to leave to her mom and dad. And we're very appreciative of it, too, of course.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a good work of art as well. The documentary, yeah.
Well, it's great to be able to relate, and we do that. In fact, most of our friends are young people. Most of the fans that I have are in their 20s and 30s, and they're young, very young people, and they all cling to us and send us emails. In fact, I've got I think I have 6,000 emails right now that most of them are fans, and I haven't answered a lot of them because you can't do that. It's like someone coming up to you and say, "Look, I only need 5 minutes of your time," and there's 100 people behind me who want the same 5 minutes each. you can't do that. You know, you just can't give your life to that kind of, what should we say, so-called celebrity, quote unquote, point of living. And this is why when you see the celebs getting into problems and trouble with their life, because they've got too much attention. The Justin Bieber, for example, he's got 10 million young ladies, you know, who want to marry him. How are you going to get around that, you know? Give me a break, right?
It's a tough life. Somebody's got to do it, though, right?
Right.
Let me read some live ads real quick here and take a little break, okay? We're with Alan Abel. His website is called Abel Raises Cain. And you can go there and you can check out his books. One of them is, what is that? Don't Get Mad, Get Even?
Don't Get Mad, Get Even is still around if you look for it, or you can go to any bookstore, Amazon.com. They have it. They do sell it up there. That's right. Amazon.
Yeah, I got a link to that book up on my blog, the Opperman Report. It'll be up there forever. So if anybody wants to check out Alan's books, but also his website too is Abel Raises Cain. I can't. And you get a copy of the movie with the commentary. You do commentary and add to it as well.
Oh yes.
Okay, well, tonight's show is brought to you by Pacific West Bamboo, 503-839-8126. Pacific West Bamboo is your #1 source for timber construction, craft-grade bamboo poles, plants, products. They specialize in eco-friendly reclaimed wood products for the home and garden. They're located in Portland, Oregon, but they service the Northwest for over 10 years, and they can and do ship nationwide. Go to Facebook, Pacific West Bamboo, 503-839-8126. It's Amanda. Over there. She's a big supporter of the show. We thank her very much for what she does for us. Mike Gray at infinityhomeplans.com. Another big supporter of the show. Check out infinityhomeplans.com. Design services, your resource for 3D and 2D draftsman services. They offer a multitude of products, including stock home plans, 2D digital drawings, 3D models, renderings, and more. That's infinityhomeplans.com. Hey, and don't forget emailrevealer.com. If you think your wife or your husband's cheating on you, you give us his email address. We can trace it back to online dating websites. If you're looking for a long-lost relative or a loved one or even an enemy, somebody you want to get even with, I should have said that. I know I can't even finish that. I can't even finish that ad now. But we can locate people for good platonic reasons, okay? Non-violent. If you want to locate somebody, we can locate them for you. And we can do asset searches on them, asset checks, criminal record searches, anything you need, any PI realm there, you go to emailrevealer.com. And don't forget, New World Mexican Women. It's really hard to describe what these women are selling. But they have a book. It's $19. The book is up on Amazon.com. The link is up on my blog, the Opperman Report. If you Google New World Mexican Women, you can find the first thing that comes up in Google. Their website is revolucion-mexicanamx /wetback-world. And that's where you can get a link to their book. The book is it's an incredible book about how these women, the men from this state in Mexico, they've all come to the United States to look for work. So there's hardly any men living in this state down there in Mexico. And these women wrote this beautiful book with love letters to their men, begging them to come back and all that kind of stuff. And it's very an interesting book. And you can also, they teach you how to make authentic Mexican jewelry. So it's a fascinating. They're mailing me a copy of the book. And me and my daughter Victoria are going to read the book, and we're going to come back. We'll be able to explain it to you a little bit better. Don't forget, freedomslips.com is a listener-sponsored station. And tonight, if you like what you're hearing, you got to hit the donate button and donate and keep the show going. CJMarsRadio.com, HazyRadio.com. We're live on all 3 stations tonight, and we're going to be rebroadcast throughout the week on a slew of stations all over the place. You can't miss us. In fact, all you have to do is just open up your window, and you can hear me talk. And you hear the great genius Alan Abel, who I tell you, Alan, you make me feel like a kid again.
Down Fifth Avenue at the Merchants of Warren to happen again. And I had my book at that time, Don't Get Mad, Get Even. I had what they call remaindered copies, I could sell. And I chose this place on the sidewalk in front of Trump Tower, and the guards chased me away saying, you can't sell your books here because the sidewalk belongs to Donald Trump. Oh, come on. The sidewalk in front of the Trump Tower belongs to Donald? No way. So I went to small claims court the next day, and the judge awarded me $900, for the loss of book sales. And I couldn't collect because I had to find the right corporation among the 200 that Donald Trump had at that time. And that's impossible. So I figured, I know what I'll do. I'll go down to Atlantic City and auction the Taj Mahal Hotel that he owns down there. Take the first $900 and give him the next $55 million. So I went down to Atlantic City and gave the sheriff $50 for the paperwork. And when the news got in the local papers, the check came through real quick for $1,000 to pay off for that. So, you have to use your imagination that way and find out ways, using your wits to win, and that's the title of the lecture that I've done at Yale University, at UCLA, and MIT, and about 100 other well-known colleges, and people relate to that. They love the idea that you can get where you want to go just using ideas. Sometimes it takes some money, if you're going to marry Idi Amin off, as I did, a look-alike at least, and it costs some money, but you got to have the entourage and make it seem real. Anyhow, that's fun. We're having fun in life, and we're doing it with a sense of spirit, a sense of, just giving people, again, that kick in the intellect that I mentioned earlier. And we enjoy doing it. It's just a lot of fun. But now it's very much more difficult because of the internet. It says there's the possibility that smokinggun.com and snoop.tv or whatever they call it, they can go after you and find out whether it's a hoax or not in a very few minutes. Doesn't take them long to do it.
But I tell you, there's some guys who have these, they run these hoaxes off the internet. They create websites, they create new characters on the internet. And as a matter of fact, I was going to have a guy on tonight with you. His name is Justin Tribble. And he did that hoax about how he claimed that he was Joel Osteen. Are you familiar with that kind of stuff?
I know. People do things like that. I know. And they take another name and they use it. There's all kinds of skullduggery going on. It's fraud. It's like, I don't know what Ed Snowden is. He's either a hero or he's a traitor. Who knows? We'll find out someday. But we've had the urging from earlier days, the fact that the government is spying on all of us and knows everything about that we trying to hide. You can't hide it anymore, and so on. But at the same time, we don't want that invasion of privacy. We respect the fact that we own something. Peace of mind, especially, is what's important, because there's a direct correlation between your mind and your living of a good life. I think. All the money in the world is not going to help. You still have to have the ability to think and use your brain and exercise and eat properly. I've been trying to keep my weight down occasionally, so it is working somewhat, although I've tried one of these nutrient diets that they advertise, and the box was much more beautiful than the meat that was inside, and I wanted to eat the box. But I couldn't do that because the box was beautiful. It had a beautiful photograph of this boiled beef that was inside. And inside, they only had half as many of the boiled beef pieces of meat that they had on the cover. So, I wrote to the company and complained, and then now they send me coupons. I can get about half a dozen free boxes of their product. I wasn't really going after that, but this is the way they try to kind of keep me at bay. And it does work, by the way. Yes, it does. And also I wanted to mention my good friend Joe Vitale. He's a very celebrated guru in Austin, Texas, who has lectured worldwide, and Hypnotic Publishing is his publishing company, and he is a great guy, and he has seminars telling people how to solve their problems. And I did one of his seminars, about 6-7 years ago, and he had a book called The Attractor Factor that he wanted to promote. And I suggested that I hadn't done the lottery hoax in 20-some years, that one with Lee, the actress. Why not do it again and have a truck driver, Bob Pagani, who pretended to be the winner, choosing the winning numbers from the book, The Attractor Factor. And we'd go to the city where they called the winning numbers of Powerball, which was up to about $300 million. So we did. To make a long story short, Bob was a great actor, improviser from Oregon, from Portland. And he sat there in this restaurant after paying for all the people's lunches who were in there, and within 15 minutes we had 100 reporters. They were staking out Lincoln, Nebraska, because that's where the winning numbers were called. And Bob had a coffee-stained cover on the book, The Attractor Factor, and claimed he leafed through the book and found the winning numbers. Well, right away, people went to Amazon.com and ordered copies of The Attractor Factor, figuring it'd be lucky for them, too. And, of course, it never is, but nevertheless, they bought the book, and it was #1 for 3 or 4 days, and the book took off. But these are the kinds of ideas that I like to play with, as he did with an earlier book about P.T. Barnum called There's a Customer Born Every Minute. And I suggest that he hold a canine concert in Austin, Texas, whereby he held a concert just for dogs on such a high frequency, only the dogs could hear it. Well, I mean, people came to the park with their dogs, my God, because the dog can't come alone. And then we had the rock band pantomiming music. You couldn't hear it because only the dogs could. But behind the bandstand were people with these high-frequency whistles, and after each tune...
Oh, my God. You're a genius,
whistles.
Man. You're a genius.
And the dogs would jump and scream and holler, as you see. And so we did that for a half hour, and then Joe came out in a P.T. Barnum costume and sold a ton of books that day. And, all because the people came to the canine concert. So these are the kinds of ideas that we're not using that much of our brain to come up with those ideas. Other people have it. You have it. There are lots of people we know, and they're dormant. But you got to use that brain, use it, and work it. And don't worry if you fall down. You get up, pick yourself up, and go on. Try again. Life is not infallible. I mean, it's filled with bruises and bumps, and you got to just keep moving with it. And that's the way. And walk zigzag when you come to New York because it's harder for the snipers,
Right.
They came.
I love you, man. Hey, I was a big fan of Bill Box. I used to watch him all the time. I tell you. Now, what about when you came up with the thing about the 18-minute gap and the Watergate tape?
Well, during the 18-and-a-half-minute gap, Jeannie and I also did a documentary called The Faking of the President, where we took all of President Nixon's press conferences that were available on film at that time, on 16-millimeter film mostly, and we edited it down under the Freedom of Information Act we got in 1976 after Nixon had resigned from the office and so on. And we took all of those films and we edited it into a 90-minute, I guess you'd call it satirical explanation of Watergate. It was called The Faking of the President. And in that, we were able to re-edit the words around because they had all that raw footage, and Nixon admitted to driving the getaway car at the Watergate break-in. He said that he was responsible for everything. And then we had Jim Dixon, who was an actor then, who looked like Nixon and had his voice and played Nixon in many roles and commercials and whatnot. And he was siphoning gas from Ed Kennedy's automobile and putting it into the presidential limousine. We had and he was over in the cemetery stealing the flowers from Franklin Roosevelt's Checkers grave and putting them on Fowler and putting them on Checkers, his own dog's grave. We had him doing all of these nefarious activities. And it was funny. Most of it was outrageous, and it was an hour-and-a-half documentary that premiered in Salt Lake City before an invited audience of 400 Mormons who were at a convention. And they rioted 20 minutes into the film showing in 1976. I was out there as producer watching across the street. I suddenly see people running out of the Capitol Theater downtown Salt Lake City, destroying all of the posters and breaking those glass case windows they had the posters in, turning the manager's car over and slashing his tires, and screaming and hollering. And they were so upset with the outrageousness because we were beating on the president when he was down, and they didn't like it. And they're Mormons. Where's religion? Well, history repeats itself. No more on that subject. And they were looking for the producer, and suddenly the sirens came and the cops came, and I went down to see if I could do anything, and the sheriff came over to me and says, look, you got to get out of the city because we've had real threats against your life, and they know you're staying down there at the Holiday Inn. So get your bag, and we're taking you to the airport. Well, it was 8 o'clock Sunday night, and I said, there are no planes out here. Well, we got a private plane waiting for you. Don't worry. They took me out there, and there is the private plane, and John Wayne is standing in the doorway with this huge frame of his, and he's waiting for me to take me to Reno to safety, and because he's a friend of the sheriff. So I get on this plane with John Wayne, and I've just had the film premiere destroyed in the theater because they couldn't show it and do it anything again with it. And John Wayne wanted to hear all about it, and for that 45-minute ride on his plane with his 12 buddies who were going there to gamble, John was in tears. He was laughing so hard all the way, because here I am saying, I'm the producer, and our film debut was destroyed. We spent a year putting this together. And he said, it's never happened in my life. He said, I've done dozens of films. But he paid all my expenses at the hotel and had me come down and watch him gamble, shooting crap and so on, and then that was it. So I was saved by John Wayne of Salt Lake City. Now, the Taking of the President couldn't play other theaters because the owners were afraid there'd be riots too. So it's never come off the shelf except for a few college dates. So we hope to get that out somehow, into the public eye one of these days.
Hey, get it on Hulu, just like your daughter's film was on.
Yeah, The Taking of the President.
Yeah.
When we did Deep Throat, when that was another satire when Bernstein and Woodward, wrote the book about how they had this guy who confessed to them all about the secrets with Nixon and what was going on in the Watergate White House and so on. Who was Deep Throat? Well, I had this guy, Bill DiPrato, an actor, pretend to be Deep Throat, and once again we had Max Sackheim backing us with money, and we rented the ballroom of the Hilton Hotel for the 200 reporters who showed up to meet Deep Throat. But his wife was there with him supposedly, and she fainted, and he fainted, and we had them both in an ambulance taken away. We rented the ambulance, and they were spirited away. But Deep Throat got great publicity in the Washington Post and the New York papers and radio and television as the guy who confessed, and an agent was there with a $100,000 check in hand, offered to buy the rights to his book story. But of course, again, we don't accept any money. We don't cross that line. That's fraudulent. You don't do it. But Deep Throat was never ever really revealed to my knowledge, any more than Barani was. Mehdi Barani, who was supposedly the bastard son of Ali Akbar, Hostaj and Rafsanjani. It takes a long while to say that name, the former president of Iran. A lot of these things have never come out before it, so this is shall we say, a
historic.
It's a private revelation for you and your show, and it should be enjoyable to people who've never heard these things. Same with Andy Kaufman. I think Andy could still be out there. Maybe he could be out there. If so, I mean, his welcome back would be incredible. It'd be so incredible. But the way he zeroed in on me when I passed away in the New York Times, he really, had to know. And I got an editorial in the Cleveland Plain Dealer because I'm from Ohio when I passed away. And that editorial also was written in such a manner that they said, if it's for real, if it's true. They always like to protect their rear end, just in case it's not right. Nowadays, anybody can pretty much find out. You just get on that computer, go to Google, and go searching, and my goodness, you got all these millions of answers, and it's overwhelming. In fact, it's too much. It's overkill. It's cyberspace and digital electronics. That's the age we're living in.
More recently, though, you did a hoax about breastfeeding.
Oh, yes. Well, ban breastfeeding was a campaign that really got me into a lot of trouble. What had happened, back in the early 90s, I guess it was, or late 90s, I think it was. Let me think about it. No, it was the year 2000, because the Republican convention in Philadelphia. Okay, there we go. And that's where I introduced ban breastfeeding, because the convention was going to be boring, and there were hundreds of reporters, and they needed a good story, so I thought ban breastfeeding, because a week earlier I'd been out in Columbus, Ohio with my sister there, and her daughter, who was married, had a little baby about 6 months, and we were all in this fashionable restaurant in Columbus, and Jane was feeding her baby at the table, the baby breastfeeding. And there are lots of people in the restaurant, and nobody seemed to be concerned necessarily. And I thought, this is kind of, bold. The young lady's feeding her little baby right here. Of course, she's hiding a little bit of it. She had a kind of a cloth that she put over it and so on. And that was it. And I thought, well, there's a lot of controversy about breastfeeding. In fact, down south, restaurants were preventing women from breastfeeding unless they went to the ladies' room. And people were upset about that because, come on, why should you have to go to the bathroom to feed your baby? When the baby's hungry, you got to feed it, right? So I thought it's a good time to ban breastfeeding, and I tested it at the 2000 Republican convention in Philadelphia, and it took off again like a grass fire. After that convention, I did 200 radio interviews about banning breastfeeding because I claimed it was an incestuous relationship between mother and child, and the baby has an obsession now with breastfeeding that manifests itself into smoking, drinking, and even homosexuality. And this created a firestorm of its own. Because in fact, one station, I think it was CHUM in Toronto, the switchboard caught on fire because there were so many thousands of phone calls coming in trying to get at me.
Okay, but Alan, how could it be? Because you did some TV. How did people not recognize you?
Well, I didn't
even recognize your voice. You did a little bit. I saw some.
I stayed away from TV. I almost got the Uncle Phil. That's a good Freudian slip. Dr. Phil.
Oh my God, that would great.
Yeah. Dr. Phil wanted me on the show. He was desperate to get me on the show. And somewhere in the course of negotiations, like I was in New York and I would have to go to Los Angeles, somebody on the staff said, I think this is this guy, Alan Abel, and they did their research and whatever they had to do at that time, and I didn't get on. But it didn't matter, so I didn't want to do TV, so I stayed with radio, and I did one or two live interviews with people, new reporters. If they were young reporters, I knew that they would be less likely to know who I was. And I didn't wear a disguise, that I'd meet in some obscure place like the bus station in New York or Grand Central Station in New York, over in the corner somewhere with lots of people, lots of noise. But I avoided personal contact. I got away with that for, 3 or 4 years, because then in 2004, we protested at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles, and we were out there at the Staples Center, and my goodness, we were overwhelmed by reporters who took to it because I claimed that mother and baby were having a licentious relationship, and that mothers were getting off with their babies and faking it with their husbands or their boyfriends.
Right, and they said Monica Lewinsky was breastfed until she was 4 years old.
Well, yeah, I said, look, Monica Lewinsky was breastfed until she was 4 years old, and her obsession went all the way to the White House. Yeah. So there you go, you see.
Let me ask you a question, man. We're coming toward the end of the show. We only got about 8 minutes. But sometimes we do an after show. We would be live on CJ Mars Radio. We drop 2 stations, but we'd still be live. And also, too, the archives go up on YouTube, so people searching for your name would be able to find these interviews. We can take some phone calls, too. Would you be interested in staying on for a little after show, like a half hour maybe? Or?
Yes, but I'd have to ask you to send your Brinks truck over to my house.
Oh, no, okay. You deserve it. You know what, man? You deserve it. You're a national treasure, my friend. And
okay.
You are. No, I'm serious, man. I'm not kidding you. All
right, yeah, we'll do that.
I love it, man. Thank you. So we're getting toward the end, like I said, on freedomslips.com and on hazyradio.com. Is there anything you want to leave people with in the last few minutes before we start taking calls and stuff?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying that we're about to, we got about 7 minutes left on Hazy Radio and on freedomslips.com. But then we'll go on CJ Mars Radio. But is there anything you want to leave the listeners with before we start taking phone calls?
There are so many areas that I've worked with and people and ideas. I tap into the news. When Salman Rushdie had a fatwa on his head for for writing the satanic verses, and the British people had to put him into hiding for years, I think it was a number of years. I had a chap I found on the subway who looked like Salman Rushdie, and I had him appear at a book convention in Washington, D.C., pretending to be Salman Rushdie. And we were at the hotel right across the street from the convention hall, the Radisson Hotel, and there were 150 reporters at that time interviewing Nancy Reagan on a book that she had written about her husband, the president. And they all left her right in the middle of their news conference to go across the street to the Radisson and meet Salman Rushdie. But for that incident, besides this guy who was tremendous, he looked so much like Salman and talked like him, behaved like him, and could give comments that we also wanted him to leave after 20 minutes, so he wouldn't be there for too long, reception and whatnot. And so we had a limo waiting for him, and we were followed by several carloads of reporters, but we outraced them and you know, distanced them to a restaurant over in Georgetown where my team of a dozen people, we were hysterical. We could hardly eat lunch. We were laughing so hard at such craziness. But it made a full page in the Washington Post and went out on the wires. And the story that Salman Rushdie was in Washington for a few minutes and then disappeared and so on and so forth. And it was fun, and we did it okay, just for fun. And sometimes there's serious things. When Sarajevo was under attack, if you remember, several decades ago, and Slobodan Milosevic, who had engineered the Balkan War in Yugoslavia and got people all aroused over the historical references 500 years ago, you know, the Ottoman family and what all they did and what they deserved. And now snipers and soldiers were on the hills of Sarajevo where they had one of the, Olympics staged there. And now people at random were being targeted and killed and wounded. So how to get them off of there? And I had a friend who had just come back from the original wars of, I think, Vietnam War, actually. That was one of his services. And he lived in Washington. He wanted to do something about it. And he called me, and I said, well, why don't we get 750 mercenaries and drop them by parachute into Sarajevo to fight Ratko Radovic, I think was the name of the commander of the Yugoslavian forces who was besieging Sarajevo. So we did. We hired about 24 actors in battle fatigues and rented the heavy equipment. They had mortars and they had machine guns, and then we had them go in a circle around in the woods, and we counted until we had 750 of them, but there were only about 24. And then we sent the video of this to all the TV stations in Yugoslavia and over in other foreign countries, in France, Germany, and they put it on the air. It was about a 5-minute clip of these officers in training, soldiers too, who were going to drop by parachute into Sarajevo and relieve that city of the besiege that they were under. Well, within a few days after those videos were mailed out, about 30 of them, Slobodan Milosevic ordered the Ratko Mladic, the commander, to pull his troops away from the mountains and the hilltops and come back. Get out of there and stop shooting the citizens, and they did. So that was always a great feat that I've enjoyed doing, and all it took was just a few handful of soldiers in battle fatigues with guns in a circle in the woods, going around and around the ring rosy, pretending that we had 750 when we only had 24.
Well, how about this then? When you're watching CNN News or Fox News, okay, well we're going to drop Revolution Radio. Good night, guys. We're going to drop Hazy Radio, but we still have with us Mr. Alan Abel, a genius hoaxer. Visit his website, abelraisescain.com. And his books I'm going to have a link to that. I got a link to all his books on Amazon.com are on my blog, the Opperman Report. So we'll see you guys next week. Next week we're doing a show by Tupac Shakur. A week after that we got Ward Churchill, and then we got Bobby Seale coming up. All right, guys, good night. If you want to call in, ed.opperman on Skype or 702-605-4894. Give us a call. Talk to